Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
It's another episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. It is the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. As always, thank you for taking the time, the trouble and the effort to download this podcast. And as we often say, if you get the opportunity to follow and subscribe to this podcast, that'll be a marvellous thing as well. You find us on Apple Podcasts, you find us on Spotify, and also you find us on YouTube. This week, we have Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. Hello, Elliot.
Hello, Duncan.
And welcome to our TPA podcast studio to Giles Dilnot, editor of Conservative Home. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, good to have you in, and so many things to talk about. I mean, first off, we'll talk about your relatively new gig, if that's all right. Several months into the role, taking the chair of the editor of Conservative Home. How's it going?
It's interesting. It's a lot of hard work. Some things have been made easier by the change in political landscape. Boy, what a change in political landscape. So there are a lot of people and Conservatives who now want to talk to us. And, you know, I can say with hand on heart, having been a government special advisor, Conservative Home wasn't the first place I went to when we were in government to land a peace. But, you know, if the electorate weren't listening, then suddenly the media decide they're not necessarily listening. And I'm there to go, here's a platform. You start talking about things, and they are, and that's great. I'm really pleased about that. That's the opportunity bit. The other thing, of course, is that the Conservatives are not in power anymore. So their influence and the need to be in with them and know about them is lessened for quite a lot of people, particularly commercial organisations, other political organisations. Like, do we really need to be investing in them at the moment? What we should be doing is talking to the government. That makes life a little bit more difficult. It's the same problem that Ian Duncan Smith identified very early on for the Conservative Party recently, I mean within days of being in opposition. You have to earn the right to be heard. So my first mission as editor is earning the right to be heard and amplifying that voice to go, you know, you might want to keep listening to what they've got to say and accepting the fact that there are some people out there who just go, but I'm not interested.
So how do you do that? What's the process?
It's got to match a little bit what the Tory party is wrangling with itself at the moment, which is, what are you for? They forgot what you were for. You didn't say, when you stepped up onto the doorstep, and by the way, for the first time in my life, I did, in this last general election, I went doorstepping in James's constituency. I worked for James Cleverley. And that's before I got this job, obviously. Yeah. And you could feel it. It was people it didn't really know what you'd become and what you stood for. And you could see that. And I actually sympathised with them. It's like, we've really come to the end of an idea of what the project was and what it was for. And you'll notice those people who got in, and we might come on to this a bit later, those people who got back in, all with reduced majority, were those people who went hyper-local and it's about me.
Yeah, I think probably a couple of points I'm quite interested in touching on. I mean, firstly, we should probably clarify for our listeners that don't know Conservative Home that well, that you are independent of the Conservative Party.
We are completely independent of the Conservative Party and will stay independent of the Conservative Party.
Albeit obviously primarily interested in the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I'm a Conservative and I want to see the Conservatives succeed and win. But who does that and how they do that is not for me to decide. They've got to come to us with the ideas that we can amplify.
Absolutely. And I think, so one of the questions I have on that basis is, obviously you were independent during when the Conservatives were in power, and you're now independent when the Conservatives are in opposition. But I was just wondering, how has the dynamic changed now that they're in opposition? Because, of course, there isn't Conservative policy to defend or attack, or to be pressured to defending or attacking. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, one of the virtues of Conservative Home has always been it doesn't simply, and its columnists and its writers, doesn't simply respond to whatever is in the zeitgeist today with, you know, hot takes and all the rest of it. It does look a bit more into the weeds and a bit more into the sort of the longer term issues. So particularly, for example, on local government, which, you know, you have always been in probably one of the best platforms for writing about issues around local government.
So one of the things that I wanted to do was to make sure that in an attempt and an effort to redefine what the party should be talking about, what resonates, where you should go, I think Kemi was wise not to put out a whole load of policy. Policy now for 4 years, I don't necessarily see that was an advantage to suddenly put out a manifesto. However, that debate about what should be in it, I want to happen on Corner Home. I spoke to a number of Conservatives in the last few months, who, especially in the run-up to Christmas, who said, the media are very happy to come and talk to me to find out what I think of what the government has just announced. And I said, but what they'll do is they'll give you the end paragraph of their piece saying, well, we spoke to the Conservatives and this is what they said about it. But they'll just give your rebuttal response. What they're not going to give you room for, and that's what you've lost by not being in government, is you're not going to get to explain what you would do instead. I will, or I will give you the space to, and you need to, otherwise no one's going to be able to make a judgment about you. And let's just understand where the Conservatives are at the moment. This is a fight against irrelevance. It's not a fight to say, okay, we've got alternative policies at the moment. It's a fight to say, stay relevant. Now, I personally think they will. I know a lot of people who think they won't. And if necessary, and I've written about this in Conservative Home, if my job is to chart the demise of the Conservative Party, that is what I will do.
So you see Conservative Home under your leadership as a critical friend
Yes.
of the Conservative Party, but also the forum, the place where Conservatives across the land can come along and help influence and possibly inform future policy.
Forum, I would go further, and crucible. I would like them to be. It started to happen actually, which is something I really wanted, was people making arguments, senior people making arguments for we should be looking at this, we should be looking at that. And at the moment, there is a window for them to do that. We haven't got to the whole collective responsibility of whatever. People are trailing ideas in a zone where, we have to confront the fact that we need some new ideas. And they can be based on old principles and values, but we need some new ideas. Is people responding to those articles go, no, I want to write an article saying that's completely the wrong way to think about it. Fine with me. I'll take a third one saying, you're both wrong, I've got something new, or I agreed with the first, or I agreed with the second. But to make that a crucible of where, if it's happening behind closed Conservative doors and policy forums and within CCHQ, fine, but why not amplify the debate wider? Because if you don't involve wider, how can anyone invest in it? And the grassroots, whatever anyone thinks of them, have a voice on our platform. It's a platform for the whole Conservative Party, not just the Conservative Party in Westminster or the Conservative Party in local government. It's everybody.
Let's talk about the challenges that face the Conservative Party. You made quite a blunt statement. It's about remaining relevant in the future, and if they become irrelevant, you will chart that demise on Conservative Home. What is for you the main challenge that's facing the Conservatives right here, right now?
Is to be believed where you come up with the policies that you think address the challenges Britain faces at the moment, and people believe, yes, you are the right people to do it. Now, I've spent nearly 2 years in government, and I've seen how government works, or rather how sometimes it doesn't work. And I want to look across the piece as, first of all, as a voter, and go, who do I believe could actually make that happen? Diagnosing the problems, the easy bit. It's how do you work out something that can be done and can be done within the constraints and honesty about the constraints of government. Now, on the piece, I see a government trying to do things and struggling surprisingly quickly, and I have my views about why that is. I see a new contender absorbing a lot of frustration and anger, who I have yet to see do the hard graft of go, okay, you've identified the problem and people like the way you're dealing with the problem. What is your solution that isn't just a headline I can take apart in about 30 seconds? And if they can do that, if Reform can do that, then they're in serious play.
Yeah, I suppose where it's not so much I'd push back on that, but something that I did find interesting on this point about diagnosing the problem, and we say that diagnosing the problem is easy, but actually I think it took a long time for the Conservative Party to diagnose the core problem, which is that Britain essentially has become ungovernable for elected officials. From my perspective, it took until really the 2022 Conservative Party conference when those conversations were really seriously being had. That's 12 years into their term of office for them to finally properly realise that. And I think on the flip side, actually, you're seeing Labour acknowledge this problem as well. There was a really interesting briefing by some Labour official to the Times newspaper over the last couple of days where they said, sometimes they just want to bang civil servants' heads against the wall or some metaphor of that kind and just tell them to get on with it. They were talking about planning policy in particular. So, I do wonder if actually the fact that the Conservatives have now diagnosed a problem, I really think they have diagnosed a problem, is a bigger success than maybe we give them credit for.
Absolutely right. And I'll tell you, it's interesting you mentioned that timescale. I entered government at the end of a 14, it's got 2 years to go. Do I think we're going to win the next general election? In my heart of hearts, I thought it was going to be a massive struggle. But I wanted to help a friend and I wanted him to do the best job he possibly could. I think we already knew, but it's quite hard to admit it when you're in government, that there is a really strange thing going on here. There are a number of times I would sit in a meeting and go, Secretary of State has asked for this. What have you come up with? And it's like, well, it's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, we can do it, Minister, but there are all sorts of... Can I bring in John, by the way? He's from legal, and we could do this, but we'll get taken to court and we'll lose. Now, back in the day, Cameron used to tell his... Let them take you to court. Test it. Test it. I think we got a bit scared of that. And then you've got this whole landscape of other bodies that go, well, if you look at the independent report from the independent people who are like, oh, are they truly independent? Okay, they're saying you really shouldn't do this. You get a whole load of obstacles thrown in the way that aren't necessary. It's not... It really isn't the same as the sort of Sir Humphrey and Yes Minister. They're trying to play a Machiavellian game. I've never really bought that. There were some excellent civil servants that I work with. But it's evolved into this is really risky. The risk aversion is enormous. Yeah. Right. The converse of that is all the time that we weren't delivering things that we wanted to, even though we were busting a gut to deliver them. I will say that, but, take it on the chin. Some things we really wanted to deliver, we did not deliver. Labour thought, the answer is the Conservatives are just really bad at this. And when we come in, there will be a sort of tacit understanding, oh, thank goodness you're here. And you saw a little bit of that.
For the first couple of weeks,
The first couple of weeks, people going, oh, thank goodness the grown-ups have arrived.
Yeah.
Until cold, hard reality bit. And suddenly they're up against the same thing. They're being presented with the same problems that we were presented with. Now, I obviously don't want to let them off the hook and say, oh, they were trying to do the right things, but they screwed it up. I think some of the things they've been trying to do are ridiculous, and some of them they didn't even say they were going to do. But this idea that we're inherently the good guys, these guys were clowns, and it's all going to open up like a Pandora's box to let us do things, was just a catastrophic strategic failure on their part. They didn't get it. Government is difficult. Yeah. It is always complicated, and most of the time it's about channeling a least worst option. It probably shouldn't be, but to break that, we need to do something very fundamental. And I think the Tories might need to be very bold.
I think so. Listen, we'll return in a few moments to where Labour currently is, because you said you've got some ideas as to how they've ended up in this current state 6.5 months in. We'll also talk in a bit more detail about your role as a special advisor. But I just want to return to reform for a second, because this week, got the Times newspaper here. You've got the results of a YouGov poll that's come out. It was commissioned by Sky News. You have Labour on 26%, Reform 25%, Conservatives 22%, and the Lib Dems 14%. You made your view view quite clear so far that, it's very easy for Reform to chuck out a headline and then people can pick over it within 30 seconds and it unravels. Is this peak Reform, do we think? This current survey of 25%?
I don't know. My prediction pre-Christmas, on lots of times I was asked, was that this will be the year where we find out whether they're all mouth and no trousers, or whether actually this is... And I'm not going to call that at the moment. Reform are doing what they need to do. They've got to keep this momentum up for a long time.
It's another 4 years, isn't it?
And so, stunts over Christmas and things like that. Well, if I was them, I'd be doing the same. You've got to keep that momentum up. They've got a couple of advantages this year. They could do well in locals. I think they probably will do quite well. And then you've got Welsh elections year after. If they can maintain it, if they can get that ground base, then they've broken, or Nigel will have broken what he couldn't necessarily find with previous incarnations, was getting that geographical foothold. But let's look at that poll. 2 points down after the most catastrophic defeat.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't necessarily surprise me. No. People still, it's still recent history to most people, the last Conservative government. That doesn't surprise me. Labour down doesn't surprise me, and Reform doing well. Well, like I said, they are going to capitalise, and why shouldn't they, on frustration with two main parties. That's why they call them the uni party.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is one of those things you can dismantle in 30 seconds. The idea that the Labour and the Conservatives are the same party is just phooey.
There was a fascinating piece in one of the newspapers in the last couple of days. It was a kind of, I hate the term, a deep dive into the Reform Party. I think it was David Maddox, the journalist who wrote it. And he talked about there was this possibility that CCHQ, Conservative Central Office, were going to set up this kind of task force, almost like a war room, to go after Nigel Farage. Put to one side... And I'd welcome your view on this, Giles, given your background. Put to one side the fact that it's very easy if you're an insurgent party to say, it's all rubbish, blah, 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 and you don't have to provide the answer. But where is the main attack line, aside from that, for Reform? On Reform? If you were targeting Reform and you're a Conservative, working at CCHQ, dabbling in the dark arts, what would you do?
Well, the boring answer straight away is you've got to go back to the maths electorally and go, if you vote for Reform, you get a Labour government. It's just there in the maths, all right? Nigel's got to break through to suggest that that's not true, and he's not there yet, all right? The other thing is, I wonder about going after Reform. I think some of the instinct is let's just concentrate on what we should be doing and let them do what they do, because there's still a long time to go. And actually, anything can happen. At the moment, 121 MPs is a lot more than 5.
Yep.
It just is. So how they utilise that, how they play, is going to be really, really interesting. And therein lies the answer to your question is, let's just see. But I'm not guaranteeing. What Nigel wants everyone to read from that poll is there is inevitability.
Yeah.
And I do not believe in inevitability. And if you do, then what's the point of doing anything? Because that means you can't change it. Of course they're going to look at that poll in the CCHQ and be worried. But the other thing is, they should definitely not be doing the... would it just be easier if we started talking to each other and doing stuff like that? When Nigel stopped saying his avowed intent is to destroy the Conservative Party, I asked him about this. I said, I understand why you want to beat us. I don't understand why you want to destroy us. Yeah. I don't know that that's your best option. The other thing is, and he knows this, Nigel doesn't like a huge body of people behind him, say 25, 30 MPs, who are all possibly impressive. He's never been comfortable with it. He knows it himself. I said to him, if you're going to have to get over that if you want to make this a success. Now, I have no idea. It may well be that we end up that there are two parties vying for power in 2029 and it's one of them's not the Conservatives. It's possible. I just don't think it's inevitable, and that doesn't scare me anymore into thinking it's inevitable seeing a poll like that.
I know Elliot's going to ask some questions in a second about where we are with the current Labour government, but first off, I just want to do a final question about Reform. do defections matter? When we see ex-Conservative MPs, former Conservative MPs, rocking up at Reform's door, does that matter? Does it make a difference?
Depends who the defector is.
Well, you all know who they are.
At the moment, yeah. So it depends on who the defector is. At the moment...
Andrea Jenkins?
I'm not going to be rude about Andrea Marco. I'm not going to be rude about any of them. It always depends. I remember... Nadine, forgive me for this, but I remember when they were angling for Tory MPs to join UKIP or Brexit Party or whatever, and people were saying, do you want Nadine? And Nigel was like, no, I don't. And
Nadine Dorries, I think.
Nadine Dorries, I'm talking about, and no disrespect to Nadine at all, but she didn't do it. Those people attempted to do it, fine, but they've. At the moment, I haven't seen one that really, really worries me and makes it. Do they exist? People thinking about it? I'm absolutely certain they do.
One of the dynamics that I'm really interested in is the way in which the public change their perception of who is to blame for our current political issues. And I think, and maybe you'll disagree with me, Giles, but I think the public do now blame Labour for the economic situation. I think they still blame the Conservative Party for most of the other country's problems, and that's very reasonable. The Conservatives were in power for 14 years, so whether it's immigration, healthcare, etc., I think the public still blame the Conservatives. But I think the perception on the economy is shifting, and I think there's a good reason for that. No matter what you could say about the Conservatives' economic management, and boy did the TPA criticise it. That £40 billion round of tax rises, that employment rights bill, that increase in the minimum wage, national living wage, has done in a very short order enormous economic damage, and it has dramatically changed the picture. So I suppose it is going to be interesting over the next year or two how quickly the public and the electorate shift the blame on other issues from the Conservatives to Labour. And that is the point where the Conservatives probably will have an opportunity, because the public won't just be looking at the Conservatives and thinking, you're to blame it for all our problems. That will start to become sort of a distant memory.
So it was not a great general election campaign from the Conservative Party. We know that. Yeah. And I can tell you from on the inside, I didn't see somebody who thought we're going to win this at all. All right? That's no great surprise to anyone. It was 14 years. The public were fed up with the Conservative Party. They were, right, they're off the table. What else are we looking at? But the signs and the problems that Labour were going to have were there almost immediately. And I think if you go to the budget, the bit where she reads out the 5-year growth forecast, growth is your central political aim of this government.
Allegedly.
To boost growth. Right. That's what you've pitched. And that's it. That's the growth projection for all this you've just announced. You've got to be kidding me. If that's the aim, let's redefine the word ambition. That's nothing. That's minuscule. At that rate, in very short order, you become a health service with a state attached. It's not, it's no joke. And the idea, which they obviously used massively, they were the opposition, of course they did, that Liz Truss crashed the economy. You could find answers to go, well, yeah, it caused a lot of problems for people's mortgages. A lot of people don't have mortgages. But actually, you see the spike in the graphs, but actually it goes back fairly quickly. Was this? Don't believe me, don't believe Labour, just look at the figures. That I said that Starmer was going to have one of the toughest springs of any Prime Minister for a long time, because it's unravelling and that growth isn't there. And all of these things were there to promote one thing. And they're not. And the timescale he set himself, you say, well, yes, it will take a long time, but soon enough, we've got a 10-year plan. Is that right? Okay. I wonder whether voters will stick with that 10-year plan. To achieve something in that timescale with this amount of pain beforehand, I think you've got a serious problem. And you didn't need to do some of these things.
Yeah, and the alternative economic policy that they ultimately will need if they want to achieve growth, which will involve a reduction in the size of the state, reduction in the tax burden, and cuts to deregulation, is not one that they're going to reach for. It's not one that a single Labour politician has on their shelf and that they're willing to take off the shelf. So, this talk about are they going to get rid of Rachel Reeves? I mean, there is no alternative to Rachel Reeves, at least as far as the Labour Party are concerned, as far as I can tell.
And they invested an awful lot in her political judgment and say-so for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So it would be incredibly difficult for him to throw her under a bus. And if he did, well, okay, that's a reset from them. But I think that would be a real sign that they've gotten themselves into real trouble. You will know this, Duncan. You've been a broadcaster. I used to work at the BBC. If you start a programme badly, it's very difficult to get to the end of that programme and feel like you got it back.
How do you think we're doing so far?
Well, we're doing fine, I think. But when you're doing that in government, you start that badly.
It's hard to call
It's
stuff
really
back.
hard to reset it.
It really is.
And I thought that by now they would have gone, right, guys, we really have not covered ourselves in glory at the moment. Okay, what do we do to turn this around? There's some serious, sensible people in there. I have respect for them. I always did. And I don't particularly like it when we see other parties going, no respect for them, they're all clowns. I'm not going to make that mistake again of just thinking somebody's a bunch of clowns. It's a real mistake. But I really didn't think they would go this badly, this quickly, and not get the recovery in. It's, 6 months. That's a long time in politics.
It might not be of much comfort to listeners to this podcast, but at least it keeps our world vaguely entertaining. Looking at the next Labour disaster.
You can go into the last election campaign and pick out things and go, we told you they were going to do that. Yeah. I mean, you weren't listening, and we completely understand why you weren't listening. But just go through some of the talking points.
Yeah.
Look at Rishi's rebuttal of Reeves' budget. It was unusual. He'd had 3 Weetabix. Doesn't matter what you think about him. Yeah. He was leaving the stage anyway, but he literally had the fire of a man who goes, I told you they would do this, and they've just done it. And they were lying about it.
Well, it's my response to anyone who tells me openly that they voted Labour in the general election. And they're moaning. I'm just like, I told you so. You've only got yourself to blame. Buyer's remorse. Listen,
what we need to fix is the fact that they didn't see us as any kind of solution to that.
Listen, we need to talk about the BBC because you're an ex-BBC person, as am I, so we'll do that as well. And also, Elliot's keen to get your thoughts on where we're heading with the Chagos Islands. But just before we look at those two areas, you mentioned a few times about your time as a special advisor to James Cleverley when he was Foreign Secretary. You mentioned it a few times and you've given examples of what you experienced. Just give us one main takeaway from your time as a SPAD. What was the most illuminating thing you learned?
With no disrespect to my colleagues who are there, if you're looking at how difficult it is to get things done, you should not just factor in outside political landscape or zeitgeist or civil service or your opposition parties. You need to factor in number 10. If you can't move number 10 on things, then you can't move. And the other thing, which everybody has known for years and years and years, but I'm not sure what the solution is the hegemony of the Treasury. If you can't get the Treasury to agree to something, you're stuck.
If you're listening to this and you fancy being a SPAD, some wise words there.
One of the key issues, Giles, or key issues at least at the moment in the foreign policy world that you were to some extent involved in while you were special advisor to the Foreign Secretary was the Chagos Islands. Now, we've just seen, just in the last few hours, a news report that the Mauritius government believes that they're close to an agreement with Labour government over the Chagos Islands. Just to brief our listeners, for those that aren't aware, this is a deal that will involve the United Kingdom giving up sovereign territory to Mauritius, who have a claim on this territory, and alongside that we're going to give them quite a significant amount of money, £9 billion is the reported fee, to give up some of our own sovereign territory. I just want to get your views on where this went wrong and how this has happened, and is this actually another issue where actually this is the Labour government to blame?
I think it's about a choice. Yeah, I mean, look, we didn't particularly want to do any negotiations. Do I wish that we could have turned around and said, no, we didn't do any negotiation on this? But to be fair, Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, bumped into the Mauritians at the UN, and his instruction wasn't to negotiate a deal with them, it was to find out what they want. Fair enough. That came to the Foreign Office, then headed by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. Very quickly that changed, and she was Prime Minister and James was Foreign Secretary, and it was like, well, we said we'd talk to them, let's talk to them. Now, as you know, we did not do a deal with the Mauritians for quite obvious reasons, I think, but we didn't do it. But just talking about it has been bad enough for us reputationally. Yeah. Look, it's predicated on the idea that Mauritius has an unanswerable claim in the courts to being sovereign, and that would put the base, Diego Garcia, under strain, and whether or not they would suddenly have sovereignty over that. It's go back to that thing about the courts, right? Keep trying it, because quite frankly, we've seen the reaction to. I shudder to think what the reaction would have been if we had concluded something.
And why are they doing it? Why do you think the government seems so eager to give it up? Because the reason why they're rushing it is because it's widely reported that the incoming Donald Trump administration is opposed to it. Why are they so desperate to do it?
I think that's why the Mauritians are saying they're close to a deal, because they've got, 10 days left to secure this. I think they've got themselves into a corner. They've announced they were going to do it. They didn't necessarily see the huge backlash with it. It's one of those things, you do it early on and then everybody forgets about it, blah, 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 blah. I just think they got backed into a corner, and now if it comes crashing down, they look as if they got completely played. They would have, of course, had the advantage of it not being a deal if it fell over. And our partners, I won't go into it too much, but our partners are just keen that the base can keep operating.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about the BBC. You and I have a vested interest, having both worked for the corporation in the past. Taxpayers Alliance this year doing some amazing work regarding where the BBC goes next. Obviously, the charter renewal, or the charter's up for renewal in 2027. I'll let you have the floor, Giles. The BBC, what does its future look like, according to you?
It doesn't look like its future looked like when I was there.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
It's changed. The BBC has a problem that I know sends chills down its upper echelons, which is that there are a whole generation of people who don't access their services and have now got older. So there's an even larger demographic section that just didn't grow up accessing BBC in any way, shape, means or form. Other choices are available. Yeah. And they are utilising those other choices. So the BBC is really worried about what happens to its audience. The other thing is, whilst we've had charter renewals and they've come with conditions and changes and whatever, it never really deals with the fact that it's all predicated on it's like copyright law. Copyright law is based on people writing notes on a piece of paper that are music. It doesn't envisage digital sharing or any of those advances. And the BBC's licence fee doesn't take in for the... Do you watch television all the time? No. Do you access everything? You can see it in the changes of their structures. They now have sort of, audio and visual rather than TV and radio. Yeah. And online, well, I was there when it started its online thing. It was definitely the younger third party. Now it's everything. There are far more people who clock onto the BBC website than watch the news at 10 or listen to the radio
so what is
Today programme.
What is its future? What future does it have? Do you value the BBC?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I do, actually.
Yeah.
Even though they can infuriate me.
So how should it be funded?
I don't know that it can escape some form of... They will defend the licence fee forever. It is actually quite good value for money, but you and I both know what the problem is about choice.
Yeah.
And if you, in a world where choice has got greater, you keep denying that choice, and that means I can't watch ITV live with it. I can't make that choice. I don't know how they escape that, and eventually... I've always had this theory that they will suddenly realise someone's serious, a government is serious, of whatever stripe, and says, no, you can't have the licence fee anymore. and it will suddenly produce an enormous amount of work that it's been doing that it's never really said it's been doing, to go, here's how we think a subscription model would function.
Yeah.
It will defend news to the last, because that's the bit that's where it's most trusted still.
But does it have a place to carry on making programmes like Strictly Come Dancing?
Well, they make a lot of money. So
That's
if
the
you're
argument.
asking the BBC to cater for its own needs, then don't necessarily take away its ability to make programmes. It did a deal years ago with something called Flex Tech in America, which meant selling really, the wildlife programmes make a fortune.
Yeah.
But that is, in the end, a form of subscription, even if it's national broadcaster subscriptions to other countries or whatever. I just don't know how they'd avoid it. At some point, the fact that nobody has a choice about whether or not they pay something for the watching on a television just doesn't make any sense in the 2030s.
Well, time will tell. The debate is well and truly underway, and it's something that we will revisit constantly here on A Nation of Taxpayers. Giles, it's been great. Thank you for coming in.
Pleasure.
Will you come in again on the future episode?
Yeah, sure.
Marvellous. Good luck with Conservative Home. Anything you'd like to say to our listeners regarding Conservative Home under your hellmanship?
A definite request, a heartfelt request, to read it.
Giles Dilnot, editor of Conservative Home. Thank you. Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you as always. This has been A Nation of Taxpayers. As always, please follow and subscribe. That helps us out. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify and also on YouTube as well. Thank you for listening.